The October wind cut through downtown Detroit like a blade, carrying with it the scent of rust and broken dreams. Sarah Martinez stood at the corner of Cass Avenue and Michigan, her thin jacket doing little to shield her from the bitter cold that seemed to seep into her very bones. The city's skeletal remains of what was once America's industrial heartland stretched before her, a landscape of abandoned factories and boarded-up storefronts that mirrored the emptiness she felt inside. At 26, Sarah's face told a story that most people couldn't bear to read. 3 jagged scars ran across her left cheek, souvenirs from a broken beer bottle thrown in rage 2 years ago. Her right arm bore the circular marks of cigarette burns, carefully hidden beneath long sleeves even in summer, but it was her eyes that revealed the deepest wounds, those dark brown pools that had learned to look down, to avoid contact, to make herself invisible in a world that had taught her she was worthless. "You're late again," Marcus sneered as she approached the rundown pawnshop where she worked. The neon sign flickered erratically, casting an eerie glow on his pockmarked face. "Customers been waiting, and you know how I feel about tardiness." Sarah's voice barely rose above a whisper. "I'm sorry, Mr. Rodriguez, the bus was—" "I don't want to hear excuses." His hand moved to his belt, a gesture that made Sarah instinctively step backward. "You know what happens when you disappoint me." The shop smelled of desperation and broken promises. Every item on the shelves represented someone's last resort. Wedding rings pawned to pay rent, guitars sold to buy medicine, family heirlooms traded for groceries. Sarah understood this economy of despair better than most. She'd been living it for the past 3 years, ever since she'd finally found the courage to leave the man who had systematically destroyed her sense of self-worth, one brutal night at a time. "There's a special job today," Marcus continued, his yellowed teeth visible in what passed for a smile. "Rich guy coming in this afternoon. Collector type. He's looking for something unique." The way he said the word made Sarah's skin crawl. "You make sure you're extra nice to him, you understand?" Sarah nodded, her stomach churning. She'd learned not to ask questions about Marcus's special jobs. The less she knew, the safer she felt, though safety was always relative in her world. The morning dragged by with its usual parade of desperate souls. Mrs. Chen brought in her late husband's watch, tears streaming down her weathered face as she accepted half of what it was worth. A young mother pawned her engagement ring, whispering apologies to a photograph in her wallet. Each transaction was a small tragedy, and Sarah felt the weight of every story. At exactly 2 p.m., the door chimed with the arrival of someone different. Sarah looked up from the inventory ledger to see a man who seemed to carry himself with the kind of quiet confidence she'd forgotten existed. He was tall, maybe 6'2", with broad shoulders that filled out his simple black leather jacket. His dark hair was peppered with grey at the temples, and his face bore the kind of weathered lines that spoke of experience rather than age. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, steel, grey, and alert. They swept the room with the practiced assessment of someone who'd learned to read danger in the smallest details. When his gaze landed on her, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the sensation of being truly seen, not just observed. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying a slight southern drawl that seemed to wrap around each word like warm honey. "I believe Marcus Rodriguez is expecting me. Name's Daniel Cross." Before Sarah could respond, Marcus emerged from the back room like a spider sensing prey in his web. "Mr. Cross, right on time. I appreciate punctuality in a man." He shot a meaningful glance at Sarah. "Sarah here will take care of whatever you need. Won't you, sweetheart?" The endearment made Sarah's skin crawl, but she managed a small nod. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly at Marcus's tone, a subtle shift that Sarah almost missed. "Actually," Daniel said, his voice taking on an edge that made Marcus straighten, "I prefer to conduct my business with the owner directly. No offense to the lady, of course." "None taken," Sarah whispered, grateful for the reprieve. Marcus led Daniel to the back room, but not before giving Sarah a look that promised consequences for later. Alone in the shop, she tried to focus on her work, but her mind kept drifting to the stranger with the kind eyes. There had been something in the way he looked at her, not with pity or disgust, but with a recognition that made her feel momentarily human again. 20 minutes later, the two men emerged. Marcus was counting a thick stack of bills, while Daniel carried a small wooden box under his arm. As they shook hands, Sarah caught fragments of their conversation. "Pleasure doing business with you, Mr. Cross. If you're ever in need of anything else—" "I'll keep that in mind," Daniel replied, but his tone suggested he had no intention of returning. As Daniel headed for the door, he paused beside Sarah's desk. "Miss," he said quietly, You dropped this. He placed a small piece of paper next to her hand, his fingers briefly touching hers. The contact was gentle, warm, and entirely unexpected. After he left, Sarah unfolded the paper with trembling hands. Written in neat block letters were the words, "Everyone deserves a second chance. DC." Below that was a phone number. "What's that?" Marcus had materialized beside her like a bad smell. "Nothing," Sarah said quickly, crumpling the paper and shoving it into her pocket. "Just trash from the floor." Marcus's eyes narrowed, but before he could probe further, the door chimed again with the arrival of another customer. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah could feel the weight of the paper in her pocket like a small flame of possibility in the darkness of her existence. The rest of the day passed in a haze of routine transactions and growing anxiety. With each hour that ticked by, Marcus grew more agitated, drinking steadily from a flask he kept hidden behind the register. By closing time, his mood had turned dangerous. "Lock the door," he ordered as the last customer left. "We need to talk." Sarah's hands shook as she turned the lock, knowing what was coming. Marcus had been building to this all day, and she'd become expert at reading the signs. The slight clench of his jaw, the way his hands curled into fists when he thought she wasn't looking, the increase in his drinking, all harbingers of the storm about to break. "You think you're smart, don't you?" he said, moving closer. The smell of cheap whiskey on his breath made her stomach turn. "Think you can play games with me?" "I don't know what you mean, Mr. Rodriguez." The backhand came without warning, snapping her head to the side and filling her mouth with the copper taste of blood. Sarah's hand flew to her cheek, but she didn't cry out. She'd learned long ago that showing pain only made it worse. "Don't lie to me," Marcus snarled. "I saw how you looked at that man today, saw how he looked at you. You think because some rich boy shows you a little attention, you're better than this place? Better than me?" Another blow, this one to her ribs, doubling her over. The familiar routine of violence began, each strike calculated to leave marks that wouldn't show in her work clothes. Marcus was an expert at this dance of degradation, having perfected his technique over the years, with various employees who had nowhere else to go. "You're nothing," he hissed between blows. "A scarred-up piece of trash that nobody wants. The only reason I keep you around is because you work for practically nothing and keep your mouth shut. Don't ever forget your place." When it was over, Sarah lay curled on the floor behind the counter, Marcus's footsteps echoing as he retreated to his office. She waited until she heard the familiar creak of his chair before slowly pushing herself upright. Her ribs screamed in protest, and she could feel the familiar warmth of blood trickling from her split lip. In the small employee bathroom, she cleaned herself up with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this countless times before. The face in the mirror looked back at her with hollow eyes, the new bruises joining the constellation of fading marks that mapped her recent history of survival. But as she dabbed at her split lip with a damp paper towel, her fingers found the crumpled piece of paper still in her pocket. She pulled it out, smoothing the wrinkles carefully. The words seemed to glow in the harsh fluorescent light. "Everyone deserves a second chance." For the first time in 3 years, Sarah Martinez allowed herself to wonder if maybe, just maybe, there was a world beyond these walls where she could be more than just a victim waiting for the next blow to fall. The thought terrified her, almost as much as it gave her hope. 3 days passed before Sarah found the courage to look at the piece of paper again. Each morning, she would wake in her studio apartment above the laundromat on 8 Mile Road, her body a symphony of aches from Marcus's latest lesson, and feel the weight of those words pressing against her consciousness like a persistent whisper. The apartment was barely larger than a prison cell, with water stains mapping the ceiling like continents of despair, and a radiator that clanged through the night like chains rattling in the wind. The single window faced an alley where stray cats fought over scraps from the dumpster behind Chen's restaurant, but it was hers, bought with money earned through silent suffering and careful budgeting of her meager wages. On Thursday morning, as Detroit's grey October sky pressed down on the city like a heavy blanket, Sarah sat on the edge of her narrow bed, turning the paper over in her hands. The writing had become smudged from her nervous handling, but the phone number remained clear. She'd memorized it by now. 313-55-0847. Her ancient flip phone, a relic from better days, sat on the small table that served as both desk and dining room. She'd picked it up a dozen times, dialed the first 3 numbers, then snapped it shut before completing the call. What would she say? What if it was a mistake? What if Daniel Cross was just another predator using kindness as bait? The bruises on her ribs had deepened to a purple-black that made it painful to breathe deeply. Each movement reminded her of her place in the world's pecking order. She was property, damaged goods that had somehow convinced herself she deserved better. But something in Daniel's eyes haunted her. There had been no leer, no calculation, no assessment of her worth as an object. Instead, she'd seen something that looked almost like respect. The memory seemed impossible, like a dream half remembered upon waking. At the pawn shop, Marcus had been particularly volatile since Daniel's visit. He'd fired 2 other employees over minor infractions and had taken to following Sarah with his eyes, tracking her movements like a hawk watching a mouse. Yesterday, he'd cornered her in the stockroom, pressing his body against hers while pretending to reach for inventory on a high shelf. "You remember what I told you about knowing your place," he'd whispered, his breath hot against her ear. "Some people might try to fill your head with fancy ideas, but you and I both know the truth. You're nothing without me, nothing without this job. Where else would a scarred-up girl like you find work?" The words had burrowed into her psyche like parasites, feeding on every insecurity she'd ever harbored about herself. By the time she'd returned to her apartment that evening, the brief flame of hope that Daniel's note had ignited had dimmed to barely glowing embers. But now, in the weak morning light filtering through her grimy window, Sarah found herself dialing the number before her courage could abandon her entirely. The phone rang twice before a voice answered. Daniel's voice, warm and alert despite the early hour. "Daniel Cross." Sarah's throat closed up. She opened her mouth, but no sound emerged, paralyzed by the sudden reality of connection. "Hello?" Daniel said gently. "Is someone there?" The word came out as barely a whisper. Sarah cleared her throat and tried again. "This is Sarah. From the pawn shop. You left me a note." There was a pause, but not the uncomfortable kind that suggested regret or surprise. It felt more like the space a person takes to choose their words carefully. "Sarah," Daniel said, and something in the way he spoke her name made it sound valuable. "I was hoping you'd call. How are you doing?" The simple question nearly undid her. When was the last time someone had asked how she was doing and actually waited for an answer? The kindness in his tone was so foreign that she almost hung up. She started to give the automatic response, fine, okay, managing, but something stopped her. "I'm scared," she said instead, the honesty surprising them both. "That makes sense," Daniel replied. "Fear is a reasonable response to uncertainty, but sometimes the scariest thing is staying exactly where we are." Sarah pressed her hand to her bruised ribs, feeling the tender reminder of her reality. "I don't understand why you gave me your number. You don't even know me." "You're right, I don't know your whole story," Daniel admitted. "But I know enough. I know you work for a man who treats you like property. I know you've been hurt in ways that go deeper than anything visible, and I know there's strength in you that you've forgotten exists. How could you possibly know that?" The question came out sharper than she'd intended, defensive walls slamming into place. Daniel was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight of experience that resonated in Sarah's chest. "Because I've been where you are, maybe not exactly, but close enough to recognize the signs. The way you move like you're trying not to take up space. The way you apologize for existing. The way you've convinced yourself that the abuse is somehow your fault." Sarah's grip tightened on the phone. "I never said I was being abused. You didn't have to. Your boss made it pretty clear what kind of man he is. The way he talked to you, looked at you, I've seen that dynamic before, I've lived it." The admission hung in the air between them like a bridge. Sarah wasn't sure she was brave enough to cross. "What happened to you?" "That's a long story, and not one for the phone," Daniel said. "But the short version is that I spent 10 years in the army, came home broken and ended up in some very dark places. It took time and help from people who saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself. And now I try to pay it forward when I can. I run a small security consulting firm. Nothing fancy, but it keeps the lights on and gives me the freedom to help when situations like yours cross my path." Sarah felt tears burning behind her eyes. "I don't know if I can be helped. I don't know if I'm worth the effort." "That's the abuse talking, not you," Daniel said firmly. "Every person has worth, Sarah. Every person deserves to feel safe, to be treated with dignity, to have choices about their own life." The words were like water to someone dying of thirst, but Sarah had learned to be suspicious of kindness. "What do you want from me? Right now?" "Nothing except for you to know that you have options, that there are people and places that can help you build a different life, if that's what you choose." "I can't just leave," Sarah said, the practical realities crashing down on her hope like a cold wave. "I don't have money, I don't have anywhere to go, I don't have any skills that would get me a real job. And Marcus, He's made it clear what happens to people who try to leave. Those are real challenges, Daniel acknowledged, but they're not insurmountable. There are shelters, job training programs, organizations specifically designed to help women in your situation. And as for Marcus, well, men like him count on their victims feeling trapped and isolated. They lose a lot of their power when that changes. Sarah walked to her window, looking down at the alley where a tabby cat was methodically searching through yesterday's garbage. The cat was thin, scarred from fights, but persistent in its search for survival. Something about its determination struck her as familiar. "I'm working today," she said finally. "I have to go in." "Of course, but Sarah, keep my number. And if things get bad, I mean really bad, you call me, okay? Day or night. I meant what I wrote on that paper. Everyone deserves a second chance, and that includes you." After hanging up, Sarah sat in the growing morning light, feeling something shift inside her chest. It wasn't hope exactly, that seemed too fragile, too dangerous to name, but it was the absence of the complete despair that had been her constant companion for so long. She looked at herself in the cracked mirror above her dresser. The same scars looked back at her, the same hollow eyes, the same evidence of a life lived in survival mode. But for just a moment, she tried to see what Daniel might see. Not just the damage, but the person who had endured it and was still standing. The revelation was both terrifying and exhilarating. For the first time in years, Sarah Martinez began to consider the possibility that her story might not be over, that perhaps it was just waiting for her to find the courage to turn the page. As she prepared for another day at the pawn shop, she slipped Daniel's number into her pocket, a talisman against the darkness that awaited her. She didn't know what came next, but for the first time in forever, she was beginning to believe that next might actually exist. The following Monday arrived with the kind of bone-chilling rain that made Detroit feel like the end of the world. Sarah hurried through the empty streets, her inadequate jacket soaked through before she'd made it 2 blocks from her apartment. The city seemed to mirror her internal state, grey, cold, and unforgiving. She'd replayed her conversation with Daniel countless times over the weekend, analyzing every word, every pause, every inflection. Part of her remained convinced it had been too good to be true, that she'd imagined the genuine concern in his voice. But another part, a part that had been dormant for so long she'd forgotten it existed, whispered that maybe, just maybe, she deserved something better than the life she'd resigned herself to living. The pawn shop felt more oppressive than usual as she unlocked the front door. The familiar smell of desperation seemed stronger, more suffocating. Marcus hadn't arrived yet, which was both a relief and a source of anxiety. His unpredictability had worsened since Daniel's visit, and Sarah had learned to read the storm clouds gathering in his increasingly erratic behavior. She'd just finished turning on the lights and starting the ancient cash register when the door chimed. But instead of Marcus, a woman entered, someone Sarah had never seen before. She was perhaps 40, with prematurely grey hair pulled back in a severe ponytail and clothes that spoke of someone who'd learned to make herself invisible. Most tellingly, she moved with the careful, measured steps of someone always calculating the nearest exit. "Excuse me," the woman said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Are you Sarah Martinez?" Sarah's pulse quickened. No one ever asked for her by name except bill collectors and court clerks. "Yes. How did you—" "My name is Elena Vasquez. I'm a counselor with the Detroit Coalition Against Domestic Violence. Daniel Cross asked me to stop by and speak with you." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She glanced nervously toward the back office, grateful that Marcus hadn't arrived yet. "I don't know what you're talking about. I think there's been a mistake." Elena's expression remained neutral, non-judgmental. "There's no mistake, Sarah, and there's no pressure. And I'm just here to let you know that if you ever need someone to talk to, or if you ever need help, there are people who care about what happens to you." "I'm fine," Sarah said automatically, the lie rolling off her tongue with practiced ease. "Really, I don't need any help." "Of course you don't need help," Elena agreed, surprising Sarah with her response. "You've been surviving on your own for years, haven't you? That takes incredible strength, but surviving and living aren't the same thing." The distinction hit closer to home than Sarah cared to admit. She busied herself with rearranging items on the counter, avoiding Eleanor's knowing gaze. "I used to work in a place like this," Eleanor continued conversationally. "Different city, different boss, but the same basic setup. Predator in charge, vulnerable employee with nowhere else to go. The pay was terrible, the hours were long, and my boss—" She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "Let's just say he believed his money gave him certain privileges. Despite herself, Sarah found herself listening intently. There was something in Elena's tone that spoke of shared experience, of battles fought and somehow won. "What happened?" Sarah asked before she could stop herself. "I stayed far longer than I should have, convinced myself that it wasn't that bad, that I deserved whatever treatment I received." Sound familiar? Elena's smile was sad but knowing. "It took a very patient counselor and a lot of small steps before I found the courage to leave. But I did leave, Sarah, and I survived. More than that, I learned to thrive." "But how?" The question burst out of Sarah with desperate intensity. "How do you start over when you have nothing, when you're nothing?" "You start by recognizing that you're not nothing," Eleanor said firmly. "You're a human being with inherent worth and dignity. Everything else can be rebuilt." Before Sarah could respond, the familiar sound of Marcus's truck pulling up outside sent ice water through her veins. "You have to go," she said urgently. "He can't see you here." Elena nodded, understanding immediately. She pulled a business card from her purse and placed it on the counter. "My direct number is on there. Day or night, Sarah, remember that." She slipped out the back exit just as Marcus entered through the front, shaking rain from his jacket and already radiating the particular brand of malevolence that meant someone was going to pay for his bad mood. "Fucking weather," he muttered, then fixed his bloodshot eyes on Sarah. "You been here long?" "Just a few minutes," Sarah replied, palming Elena's card and sliding it into her pocket with practiced discretion. Marcus studied her suspiciously, his paranoia heightened by whatever substances he'd been consuming over the weekend. "Anyone come by? Any visitors?" "No, sir, just me." He grunted, seemingly satisfied, and disappeared into his office. Sarah heard the familiar sounds of his morning routine, the crack of a beer can opening, the rustle of newspaper, the scrape of his chair as he settled in to survey his kingdom of desperation. The morning passed uneventfully, but Sarah could feel the tension building like pressure before a storm. Marcus emerged periodically to bark orders or criticize her work, each interaction leaving her more on edge. By lunchtime, she was jumping at shadows. "I'm going out," Marcus announced around noon. "Some asshole thinks he can stiff me on a loan. Time to remind him how business works around here." The way he cracked his knuckles made Sarah's stomach turn. "You keep things running while I'm gone. And if that fancy boy from last week shows up, you call me immediately. You understand?" Sarah nodded, relief flooding through her at the prospect of a few hours without his oppressive presence. But her relief was short-lived. 20 minutes after Marcus left, the door chimed again, and her heart sank as she recognized the customer, Tommy Brennan, one of Marcus's regular clients, and a man whose reputation for violence preceded him like a toxic cloud. Tommy was built like a human bulldozer, with arms covered in prison tattoos and eyes that held all the warmth of a shark's. He'd been in several times before, always making Sarah deeply uncomfortable with his leering stares and crude comments. "Well, well," he said, locking the door behind him and flipping the closed sign. "Look what we have here. All alone, are we, sweetheart?" Sarah's mouth went dry. "Marcus isn't here right now, but he'll be back soon. If you want to wait—" "I'm not here for Marcus," Tommy interrupted, moving closer to the counter. "I'm here for you." The words sent terror shooting through Sarah's nervous system. She glanced toward the back exit, calculating distances and obstacles. "I don't understand." "Sure you do. Marcus owes me money, and when people can't pay their debts, sometimes alternative arrangements have to be made." His smile revealed teeth-stained yellow from years of neglect. He mentioned he had a pretty little employee who might be willing to help settle his accounts. The implication hit Sarah like a sledgehammer. Marcus had offered her as payment for his debts. The betrayal was so complete, so dehumanizing, that for a moment she couldn't breathe. "No," she said, surprised by the firmness in her own voice. "Absolutely not." Tommy laughed, a sound like broken glass. "That's not really your choice to make, sweetheart. See, Marcus and I have an understanding. He gets to keep his kneecaps and I get to collect what I'm owed one way or another." He reached across the counter, his meaty hand closing around Sarah's wrist with crushing force. The touch triggered every alarm in her nervous system, awakening memories of countless other hands that had taken what they wanted without permission. But something was different this time. Instead of the familiar paralysis of terror, Sarah felt something else rising in her chest, a white-hot fury that she barely recognized as her own. "Let go of me," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Or what?" Tommy sneered. "You'll call the cops? File a complaint? We both know nobody cares what happens to trash like you." The words might have broken her a week ago, but Elena's voice echoed in her mind. You're a human being with inherent worth and dignity, and behind that, Daniel's quiet certainty. Everyone deserves a second chance. Sarah looked Tommy directly in the eyes, refusing to flinch from his predatory gaze. Let go of me or I'll make you regret it. For a split second, uncertainty flickered across Tommy's features. He'd expected submission, compliance, the easy victory of another broken spirit. Instead, he found himself looking into the eyes of someone who had finally remembered she was worth fighting for. The moment stretched between them like a taut wire, crackling with potential violence. Sarah could feel her heart hammering against her ribs, but she didn't look away, didn't apologize, didn't make herself smaller. For the first time in years, she stood her full height and refused to be invisible. Whatever Tommy saw in her expression made him release her wrist, but his retreat was tactical rather than defeated. This isn't over, bitch. Marcus owes, and one way or another I'm going to collect. He unlocked the door and stalked out, but not before delivering a parting threat. You tell your boss he's got until Friday. After that, things get complicated for everyone around here. Alone in the shop, Sarah sank into the chair behind the counter, her hands shaking with delayed reaction. She pulled out Elena's card and Daniel's crumpled note, staring at them as if they were lifelines thrown to a drowning woman. For the first time, she truly understood that staying meant more than enduring Marcus's abuse. It meant becoming currency in a transaction she had no part in negotiating. The realization was terrifying, but it was also liberating in a way she hadn't expected. Sarah Martinez picked up her phone and began to dial Elena's number. It was time to stop surviving and start living. Elena Vasquez answered on the first ring as if she'd been waiting by the phone. "Sarah, are you okay?" The concern in Elena's voice nearly undid Sarah's fragile composure. She pressed her back against the locked door of the pawn shop's bathroom, the only place she could find privacy to make the call. "No," Sarah whispered, the single word carrying the weight of years of suppressed terror. "I'm not okay. Something happened today, and I need help. Tell me what happened." In halting sentences, Sarah recounted Tommy's visit, Marcus's betrayal, and the growing certainty that her situation was spiraling towards something she might not survive. Elena listened without interruption, her silence providing a safe space for Sarah's words to find their way into the light. "Sarah," Elena said when she finished, "you did the right thing by calling. What you're describing isn't just abuse anymore, it's human trafficking. Marcus is using you as collateral for his debts, and that makes you a victim of a federal crime." The words hit Sarah like a revelation. She'd known what was happening was wrong, but she'd never had language to describe the full scope of her victimization. Somehow naming it made it feel less like a personal failing and more like a crime that had been committed against her. "What do I do?" Sarah asked, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "First, you understand that none of this is your fault. Second, you know that there are people ready to help you build a new life. And third, you start making a plan." Over the next 20 minutes, Elena outlined the resources available to Sarah. There was a safe house across town that could provide immediate shelter, legal aid attorneys who specialized in trafficking cases, job training programs that could give her marketable skills, medical care for the injuries Sarah had never reported. Most importantly, there were people who would stand with her if she decided to press charges against Marcus. But, Elena cautioned, leaving isn't going to be easy. Men like Marcus don't let their victims go without a fight. We need to be strategic about how and when you make your move. They arranged to meet that evening at a coffee shop 6 blocks from the pawn shop. Helena would bring Sarah's intake paperwork for the safe house and connect her with other women who had survived similar situations. But first, Sarah had to get through the rest of the day without raising Marcus's suspicions. When Sarah emerged from the bathroom, she found Marcus had returned from his collection call. His knuckles were scraped raw, and there was a satisfaction in his expression that made her stomach turn. She busied herself with inventory, hyper-aware of his every movement as he settled into his usual routine of counting money and making threatening phone calls. "You been behaving yourself while I was gone?" Marcus asked around 4 o'clock, his voice carrying the casual menace that meant he was fishing for information. "Yes, sir. Just a few customers. Nothing unusual." Marcus studied her with the predatory focus of a snake tasting the air for prey. "Tommy Brennan stopped by earlier, said he had an interesting conversation with you." Sarah's blood turned to ice, but she forced herself to keep sorting through the jewelry case. "He was looking for you. I told him you'd be back later." "That's all? That's all?" Marcus's chair creaked as he leaned back, still watching her. "Good. Because Tommy's got a big mouth and sometimes he gets ideas about things that ain't his business. But he knows better than to cause problems for me, don't you think? The threat was clear, but for the first time Sarah didn't feel the familiar paralysis of terror. Instead, she felt something closer to anger, a clean, bright fury at being treated like property by men who had never bothered to see her as human. "I'm sure he does," she replied evenly. The rest of the afternoon crawled by with agonizing slowness. Every customer who entered the shop made Sarah jump, expecting to see Tommy returning with reinforcements or worse. But somehow, she made it to closing time without incident. "Lock up when you're done with the register," Marcus instructed as he prepared to leave. "And Sarah, remember what I said about knowing your place. Some lessons hurt more than others, if you catch my meaning." After he left, Sarah completed her closing duties with mechanical precision, her mind focused entirely on the meeting ahead. She'd packed a small bag that morning, just essentials hidden in her work locker, and retrieved it now with hands that barely trembled. The coffee shop Elena had chosen was a small independent place called Sanctuary Grounds, and the name felt prophetic as Sarah pushed through the door. The warmth hit her immediately, along with the smell of fresh coffee and something that reminded her of hope. Elena was already there, sitting in a corner booth with her back to the wall, a positioning choice that Sarah recognized as the habit of someone who'd learned to always watch the exits. With her was another woman, perhaps 35, with short auburn hair and eyes that held the particular wisdom that comes from surviving the unsurvivable. "Sarah," Eleanor said, standing to embrace her. The contact was gentle, consensual, and completely different from the grabbing hands she'd endured for so long. "This is Maria Santos. She's going to be your advocate through this process." Maria's handshake was firm, confident. "I know this is scary," she said, "but you're not alone anymore. I went through something very similar 5 years ago, and I want you to know that there is life after this. Real life, not just survival." They spent the next 2 hours going through Sarah's options. The safe house had a bed available immediately. The legal aid clinic could file restraining orders and begin building a case against Marcus. There were government programs that could provide temporary financial assistance while Sarah got back on her feet. But most importantly, they talked about Sarah's dreams, the parts of herself she'd buried so deep she'd forgotten they existed. "Before all this started," Maria asked gently, "what did you want to do with your life?" The question caught Sarah off guard. It had been so long since anyone had asked about her wants, her dreams, her future. I used to want to be a teacher," she said hesitantly. "Elementary school kids. I loved working with them when I was in college, before everything went wrong." "Teaching requires a bachelor's degree," Elena noted, pulling out a tablet to take notes. "Where were you in your education when you had to stop?" "I was a junior at Wayne State, education major with a minor in art." The words felt strange in her mouth, like speaking a language she hadn't used in years. Maria's eyes lit up. "The Safe House has a partnership with Wayne State for women returning to school. There are scholarships, flexible scheduling, even childcare if you need it. You could finish your degree, Sarah, you could teach." The possibilities seemed too vast to comprehend. For 3 years, Sarah's world had shrunk to the size of the pawn shop and her tiny apartment. The idea that she could expand beyond those walls, could reclaim her dreams and build a future, felt simultaneously exhilarating and terrifying. "What about Marcus?" Sarah asked, voicing her deepest fear. "He's not going to just let me disappear." "And Tommy, he said Friday. That's 3 days from now." Elena and Maria exchanged glances, the kind of wordless communication between professionals who'd handled cases like this before. "We've been coordinating with Detective James Morrison at Detroit PD," Elena explained. "He specializes in trafficking cases, and he's been building a file on Marcus for months. Your testimony could be the key to shutting down his operation." "Other women have come forward?" Sarah asked. "2 others so far, but their cases were harder to prove because they left town immediately after escaping. You're the first potential witness who's been willing to stay and fight." The weight of responsibility settled on Sarah's shoulders. She thought about the desperate faces that passed through the pawn shop daily, the young women who worked the streets outside, the victims who might come after her if Marcus wasn't stopped. "What do I have to do?" Maria leaned forward, her expression serious but supportive. "First, we get you somewhere safe tonight. Then we work with Detective Morrison to document everything, the abuse, the threats, the attempted trafficking. It won't be easy, Sarah. Marcus has connections and he's going to fight back, but we'll be with you every step of the way." Eleanor pulled out a cell phone, a new smartphone, still in its packaging. "This is yours. It has all our numbers programmed in. plus a direct line to Detective Morrison and the safe house. There's also a GPS tracker that the police can use to find you if something goes wrong. Sarah stared at the phone, a tangible symbol of the new life she was choosing. When do we do this? Now, Maria said simply. We drive to your apartment, get whatever you need, and take you to the safe house. By tomorrow morning, you'll be under police protection and Marcus will be facing federal charges. As they gathered their things to leave, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the sensation of people caring about her well-being without expecting anything in return. Eleanor and Maria weren't trying to use her or control her. They were simply offering her the chance to reclaim her own life. Outside the coffee shop, Detroit's October night felt different than it had that morning. The same cold wind was blowing, the same grey clouds were gathering overhead, but Sarah no longer felt like she was facing them alone. For the first time in 3 years, Sarah Martinez was about to make a choice based on what she wanted, rather than what she feared. The realization was both terrifying and liberating, but as she climbed into Elena's car, she knew there was no going back. The woman who had spent years making herself invisible was finally ready to be seen. Sarah's apartment had never felt smaller than it did at 10 o'clock that Tuesday night, with Elena and Maria standing guard while she gathered her few possessions. 3 years of her life fit into 2 grocery bags and a worn backpack, a depressing testament to how completely she disappeared into survival mode. Take anything that has sentimental value, Maria advised, watching Sarah hesitate over a photo of her parents. Once you're in the safe house, you won't be able to come back here for several weeks. The photograph showed Sarah at her college graduation, flanked by her parents who had driven up from Toledo for the ceremony. She'd been so full of hope that day, so certain that the world was opening up before her like a flower. Her mother's cancer diagnosis had come 6 months later, followed by the medical bills that had forced Sarah to drop out of Wayne State and take the first job she could find. That job had led to Marcus, and Marcus had led to 3 years of hell she was only now beginning to escape. My parents died thinking I was a failure, Sarah said quietly, running her thumb over her mother's face in the photo. I never got the chance to show them I could be something more. They knew, Elena said gently. Parents always know, and wherever they are now, they're proud of you for fighting back. A sound in the hallway outside made all 3 women freeze. Footsteps on the stairs, heavy and deliberate. Sarah's blood turned to ice as she recognized the particular rhythm of Marcus's boots. He shouldn't know I'm here, Sarah whispered, her voice tight with panic. I never told him where I live. Maria was already pulling out her phone to call Detective Morrison, while Elena moved to the window to check for other exits. But they were on the 3rd floor with nowhere to go except through the front door, which Marcus was now pounding on with increasing violence. Sarah! His voice boomed through the thin wood. I know you're in there, you lying bitch. Open this door right now. How did he find me? Sarah asked, her voice barely audible. Doesn't matter now, Elena said, moving away from the window. What matters is that we have Detective Morrison on speed dial, and Maria's already called this in. Help is coming. The pounding intensified, accompanied by Marcus's escalating threats. You think you can just disappear on me? Think you can cost me money and walk away? You belong to me, Sarah. You're nothing without me. Between the threats, they could hear another voice, Tommy Brennan, apparently serving as Marcus's backup for this intimidation visit. Just break the fucking door down already. Nobody's gonna call the cops in this neighborhood. Sarah sank onto her narrow bed, overwhelmed by the familiar paralysis of terror. This was exactly what she'd feared would happen, that trying to escape would only make things worse, that she'd end up putting other people in danger, that she'd prove Marcus right about being worthless and helpless. But then Maria sat beside her, taking her hand with the same gentle firmness she'd shown at the coffee shop. Look at me, Sarah. You are not the same woman who walked into that pawn shop this morning. You made phone calls, you asked for help, you stood up to a man who tried to assault you. You are not powerless anymore. The door frame cracked under Marcus's assault, and Sarah could see splinters of wood falling to the floor. In maybe 30 seconds, he'd be inside her sanctuary, and all her careful plans for escape would crumble into violence and recrimination. I can't do this, Sarah said, tears streaming down her face. I'm not strong enough. Yes, you are, Elena said firmly, positioning herself between Sarah and the door. But you don't have to do it alone. The door gave way with a sound like breaking bones, and Marcus burst into the apartment with Tommy close behind. Both men were clearly intoxicated, their movements unsteady, but their intentions unmistakably violent. Well, well, Marcus sneered, taking in the scene. Having a little party, are we? And who might these ladies be? Elena stepped forward, her voice calm and professional despite the danger. My name is Elena Vasquez, and I'm a licensed social worker with the Detroit Coalition Against Domestic Violence. This is Maria Santos, a victim's advocate. We're here legally, and the police have already been called. Marcus laughed, a sound like gravel in a blender. Social workers? That's rich. You think some do-gooder bitches are gonna save this worthless piece of trash? He pointed at Sarah with visible contempt. She belongs to me. I own her, and I'm taking her home. No, Sarah said, the word escaping her lips before she could stop it. You don't own me. The simple statement seemed to surprise everyone in the room, including Sarah herself. But once the words were out, she found more following them, as if a dam had burst inside her chest. You don't own me, she repeated, standing up despite the trembling in her legs. I'm not your property. I'm not your slave. I'm a human being, and I have rights. Marcus's face contorted with rage. Rights? You think you have rights? After everything I've done for you? Given you a job when nobody else would hire a scarred-up freak like you? Put a roof over your head when you were living in your car? You mean after you threatened to fire me if I didn't let you grope me? Sarah shot back, her voice growing stronger with each word. After you burned me with cigarettes when I tried to refuse your advances? After you tried to sell me to Tommy to pay your gambling debts? The accusations hung in the air like accusations, and for a moment, Marcus seemed genuinely shocked that his victim was fighting back with words instead of cowering in silence. You lying cunt, he snarled, starting toward her. I'll teach you to show some respect. But Elena and Maria moved to flank Sarah, creating a human barrier between her and her abuser. Touch her and you'll be facing federal charges for assault on top of everything else, Elena warned. The FBI is already building a trafficking case against you, Marcus. Don't make it worse. Trafficking? Tommy laughed nervously. Nobody's trafficking anybody. We're just here to collect what's ours. Sarah isn't property, Maria said evenly. She's a human being who's been systematically abused, threatened, and coerced into forced labor. That's the textbook definition of human trafficking under federal law. The sound of sirens in the distance made everyone in the room tense. Marcus's eyes darted toward the broken door, clearly calculating his options. But Sarah could see the desperation beneath his bravado, the recognition that his carefully constructed world of power and control was collapsing around him. This isn't over, he said, backing toward the door. You think the cops can protect you forever? Think you can just walk away from your obligations? I know where you work, where you shop, where you hide. And when they're not watching, I'll be there. Actually, said a new voice from the doorway, I think it is over. Detective James Morrison stepped into the apartment, his badge visible on his jacket and his hand resting casually on his service weapon. Behind him were two uniformed officers, effectively blocking any escape route Marcus might have been considering. Marcus Rodriguez, Detective Morrison said formally. You're under arrest for human trafficking, assault, battery, unlawful imprisonment, and breaking and entering. Tommy Brennan, you're under arrest as an accessory. He began reading them their rights as the uniformed officers moved in with handcuffs. Sarah watched in amazement as the two men who had terrorized her for so long were reduced to ordinary criminals being processed by the justice system. Marcus tried to maintain his defiant swagger, even as the cuffs clicked around his wrists, but she could see the fear in his eyes, the same fear he'd spent years cultivating in his victims. You'll regret this, Marcus called out as they led him toward the door. Nobody's going to believe a word from a damaged whore like you. Nobody cares what happens to trash. For a moment, the old Sarah wanted to believe him, wanted to retreat into the familiar safety of self-hatred and worthlessness. But then she felt Elena's hand on her shoulder, saw Maria's encouraging smile, and remembered Daniel's words, everyone deserves a second chance. You're wrong, Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly across the destroyed apartment. I'm not trash. I'm not damaged goods. I'm a survivor, and people do care what happens to me. As the police led Marcus and Tommy away, Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, a lightness she hadn't experienced in years. For the first time since this nightmare began, she was truly free to choose her own path forward. Detective Morrison approached her with gentle professionalism. Ms. Martinez, I know this has been traumatic, but I need to ask if you're willing to give a statement tonight. Your testimony is crucial to making sure these men can't hurt you or anyone else. Sarah looked around at the women who had stood with her in her moment of greatest danger, who had literally put their bodies between her and violence without expecting anything in return. She thought about the other victims who might be saved if Marcus's operation was shut down permanently. Yes, she said firmly. "I'll tell you everything." As they prepared to leave for the police station, Sarah took one last look at the apartment that had been her prison for so long. Tomorrow she would wake up in a safe house, surrounded by people who saw her as a human being, worthy of respect and protection. Tomorrow, she would begin the long journey of reclaiming the dreams that Marcus had tried to steal from her. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, Sarah Martinez was going to sleep as a free woman. 2 years later, Sarah Martinez stood in front of her new classroom at Lincoln Elementary School in downtown Detroit, watching 23 eager third graders file through the door for the first day of the school year. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting golden rectangles across the colorful posters and carefully arranged learning centers that she'd spent the entire summer preparing. "Good morning, class," she said, her voice steady and warm. "Welcome to third grade. I'm Ms. Martinez, and I'm so excited to learn and grow with all of you this year." The children responded with a chorus of, "Good morning, Ms. Martinez," their voices bright with anticipation and nervous energy. As they settled into their seats, Sarah caught her reflection in the classroom window and marveled at the woman looking back at her. The scars were still there, they always would be. The 3 jagged lines on her left cheek had faded to pale silver, and the circular burns on her arm were mostly hidden beneath the sleeves of her cheerful yellow cardigan. But everything else had changed. Her eyes held light again, bright with purpose and genuine joy. Her shoulders were straight, her smile genuine, and her presence filled the room with the kind of confidence that comes from knowing your worth. The journey to this moment had been anything but easy. The first 6 months in the safe house had been a daily battle against depression, trauma, and the persistent voice in her head that whispered she didn't deserve happiness. There had been setbacks, panic attacks triggered by unexpected sounds, nightmares that left her shaking and afraid to go back to sleep, moments when the weight of rebuilding her life felt impossible to bear. But Elena and Maria had been there for every step, along with Dr. Rachel Chen, the trauma therapist who'd helped Sarah understand that healing wasn't linear and that strength could coexist with vulnerability. Most importantly, Daniel Cross had kept his promise to be available whenever she needed someone to remind her that second chances were real. "Ms. Martinez," a small voice interrupted her thoughts. Taisha, a girl with bright eyes and hair tied back in colorful ribbons, was raising her hand tentatively. "Why do you have those marks on your face?" The question might have sent the old Sarah into a spiral of shame and self-consciousness, but this Sarah, the one who'd fought for her freedom and won, simply knelt down to Aisha's eye level and smiled. "Those are scars, Aisha. They're from a time in my life when I was hurt by someone who wasn't very kind. But you know what? They remind me every day how strong I am and how important it is to be gentle with others." "Do they hurt?" asked Marcus, a coincidence of names that had initially made Sarah's stomach clench, but which she'd learned to separate from her past. "Not anymore," Sarah replied truthfully. "Sometimes our bodies heal faster than our hearts, but given enough time and care, we can heal completely. The scars just become part of our story, proof that we survived something difficult and came out stronger." As the day progressed, Sarah found herself marveling at how natural teaching felt, how right it seemed to be guiding young minds through their daily discoveries. During recess, she stood in the playground watching her students run and laugh, and felt a deep sense of gratitude for the path that had led her here. "Excuse me, Ms. Martinez." Sarah turned to find Daniel Cross approaching across the playground, looking exactly as he had that first day in the pawn shop, confident, kind, and carrying himself with the quiet strength that had first given her hope. But now she could see him clearly, without the filter of fear and desperation that had colored their early interactions. "Daniel," she said, genuinely pleased to see him, "what brings you to Lincoln Elementary?" He smiled, pulling a manila envelope from his jacket. "I have some news I thought you'd want to hear in person. The federal prosecutor called this morning." Sarah's heart skipped, though not with the old fear. Marcus and Tommy had been in federal prison for 18 months, and their trial was finally reaching its conclusion. "Marcus pled guilty to all charges," Daniel continued. 25 years, no possibility of parole for 15. Tommy got 12 years. But more importantly, the judge ordered Marcus to pay full restitution to all his victims, including funding for your college tuition through your master's degree. The news hit Sarah like a wave of vindication. Justice had been served, but more than that, the money would allow her to pursue the advanced education she'd always dreamed of. "I can't believe it," she whispered. "Believe it," Daniel said gently. "You stood up, you fought back, and you won. Not just for yourself, but for every woman who might have ended up in his web if you hadn't been brave enough to speak up." They walked together toward the school building, their conversation interrupted by the bell calling students back to class. As they reached the door, Daniel paused. "Sarah, there's something else. Elena and Maria are starting a new program, a training initiative for law enforcement and social workers on trafficking recognition and victim support. They want you to help develop the curriculum, maybe even teach some of the sessions." The offer was both thrilling and terrifying. The idea of standing in front of professionals, sharing her story, helping to train the people who would help future victims, it felt like the completion of a circle she'd begun when she first found the courage to call Elena. "I'll need to think about it," Sarah said. "It's a big step." "Of course, but Sarah?" Daniel's expression grew serious. "You have something those professionals need to hear. You have lived experience, survivor wisdom, and the kind of strength that can only come from walking through hell and choosing to help others find their way out." That afternoon, as Sarah graded her students' first writing assignments, she came across a story from Aisha about wanting to be a teacher when she grew up, like Ms. Martinez, who is brave and kind and makes everyone feel safe. The simple words brought tears to Sarah's eyes, not of sadness but of overwhelming gratitude for the life she'd been able to build. Her phone buzzed with a text from Elena. "Dinner tonight? Maria found a new restaurant that serves the best Mexican food this side of the border. Plus, we want to hear about your first day." Sarah smiled, typing back, "Absolutely. And I have news about the program you mentioned." That evening, sitting in a cozy restaurant with the women who had become her chosen family, Sarah raised her glass of sparkling water in a toast. "To second chances," she said, looking around the table at Elena, Maria, and Daniel, who had joined them for the celebration. "To the people who see worth in broken things and help them become whole again, and to the knowledge that no matter how dark things get, there's always a way back to the light." "To Sarah Martinez," Elena replied, "who took her second chance and turned it into a gift for the world." As they clinked glasses, Sarah felt the last vestiges of her old identity. The frightened, broken woman who had believed she deserved nothing but pain finally slip away completely. In its place stood someone she was proud to be, a teacher, a survivor, an advocate, and a woman who knew her own worth. Later that night, alone in her small but comfortable apartment near the school, Sarah sat at her desk grading papers and planning the next day's lessons. The walls were covered with thank you cards from former students at the Literacy Center, where she'd volunteered during college, photos from her Wayne State graduation ceremony, and a framed copy of her teaching certificate. On her bedside table sat two items that had traveled with her through every stage of her journey: the crumpled piece of paper with Daniel's phone number and the simple message that had changed her life: "Everyone deserves a second chance," and a photo of her parents at her college graduation, their faces glowing with pride. "I did it, Mom and Dad," she whispered to the photograph. "I became the person you always believed I could be." Outside her window, Detroit sparkled with the lights of a city that refused to give up, a city that understood the power of rebuilding, of taking something broken and making it beautiful again. Sarah Martinez had learned that same lesson, and tomorrow she would teach it to 23 third graders who deserved to know that they too could overcome anything. The scars would always be part of her story, but they were no longer the end of it. They were simply the proof that she had survived, that she had fought and that she had won. And in the end, that made all the difference.